Imagine hearing the voice of God himself. That was the perception of 77 million Japanese. Their Emperor Hirohito finally broke his silence and conceded that Japan needed to end the war. As his surrender spread across the airways of Japan, there was a separate radio broadcast down under.
Fellow citizens, the war is over.
Our Prime Minister Ben Chifley found himself at a crucial point in history. The last time a world war had ended, we cut corners on the rebuild. When the wave of the 1929 Wall Street crash came, it showed that we had ignored the warnings. Our house had simply been built on sand and it came crashing down. So this time, Chifley was adamant. Australia would build on rock. So just imagine for a second how hard it would be to be Ben Chifley. The legendary Prime Minister John Curtin had died just weeks before the war ended, and now you were tasked with rebuilding the nation. Of course, this would be without repeating the mistakes of what came after World War I. Luckily, Chifley was probably the perfect person to be leading this job. Back in 1935, Chifley was tasked with helping conduct a supreme investigation into how Australian banks made the Depression so much worse for us. In a royal commission, the government effectively has the power to leave no stone unturned. And what Chifley found was pretty interesting.
The Prime Minister announced his agenda for the rest of the 1920s: prosperity and growth.
So for most of the 1920s, Australia was led by this guy called Stanley Bruce. He was from the Nationalist Party. Essentially, during the war, our Labor Prime Minister Billy Hughes defected from the party because they wouldn't support him introduce conscription. His supporters then merged with the Liberal Party to become the Nationalists. Bruce took over from Hughes and introduced a post-war policy that would make Fifi Box proud. He called it Triple M. We want more men, markets, and money. Chifley came to the conclusion that the quest for more put an extreme amount of stress on the economy that we simply couldn't hold. When it came to the first M, which was men, Bruce flirted with the idea of Australia becoming a new America. The USA was thriving with its population of 110 million, and if you look at this map, it would seem like Australia had the potential to rival the States. But if I colour that map in, it becomes pretty clear why we could never house that many. Bruce's plan was to have men come, but rather than settle in the cities, get their own farms. Given that Australia is an extremely water scarce country, this would require significant work like building dams and lots of pipes to irrigate rivers like the Murray-Darling down here. Now, this was the era of the White Australia policy, and so there was only one place that Bruce was going to turn to for men: Britain. For the UK, this was brilliant. They had struggled with unemployment, and so this was the way they could get that percentage down. Look at this map right here. It's from Britain in the 1920s. Yes, some of that green has simply been deforested since, but it's still a massive exaggeration of how green Australia is. This was by design. So British families came in droves, quite literally seeking greener pastures. From 1921 to 1929, 300,000 migrants came from Britain. To build the infrastructure to make Australia green enough for them, it cost the government about £31,400 per family. Joan Beaumont's book is where I'm getting those numbers from, by the way. The cumulative cost of housing these migrants was about £34 million, and given that the government was barely making half of that each year in revenue, it was completely unsustainable. So Bruce was hoping that the second M could pay off that investment: markets. This was the era of the Roaring Twenties, and for the first time, Australians were going to the movies and buying cars. Given that there was no Holden and no Red Dog yet, this meant that we were importing huge amounts from overseas. Bruce was hoping that all of these rural migrants would produce valuables like wool so that we could export stuff back and get other countries money. He pushed Britain hard to create a tariff-free zone amongst the empire and for there to be no import taxes across the Commonwealth. To be fair to Bruce, he did get Britain to lower them, but not anywhere near enough for us to become a major exporter. Each year, we continued to import more than we exported abroad, and we made nowhere near enough money from things like wool exports to pay off the investment. So men and markets had failed, but there was still one final M: money. Sure, the government budget couldn't afford to house these migrants, but we could get loans from foreign banks, right?
In times of great prosperity, the world turns to the center of the empire and to London for money.
So London was the banking headquarters of the world. Centuries of getting resources from all over the world and trading it for money gives you pretty good cash reserves. As part of its empire, Australia received privileged access and could get loans from the Bank of England for better interest rates than the rest of the world. To quote Beaumont, Australia treated this status as a right rather than a privilege and became very dependent on these loans. Across state and federal level, 25% of the government spending came from external loans. To give you perspective, this bar represents the amount borrowed from all of Britain's Middle Eastern and African dominions combined. This right here represents how much Australia borrowed. But you don't need to be an economist to realise that you need to find a way to repay your debt. With the immigration scheme so unsuccessful, and with our exports not really improving throughout the 1920s, the Bank of England started to get nervous. Its chairman, Otto Niemeyer, even said this: "How is Australia going to pay her way if this process continues?" No Australian government had ever defaulted on a debt, but as the 20s passed, it didn't seem like there were many alternatives. But not gonna lie, Stanley Bruce had some pretty insane luck and he got voted out in 1929. You might be thinking, wait, why is that lucky? Well, he never had to deal with the mess. Just 12 days after Labor's James Scullin won the 1929 election, Wall Street crashed hard. For years, people had been borrowing from the bank to invest in shares. Not because these companies were valuable, but because they were perceived to be valuable. This is what we call a bubble, where something has an artificially inflated value. But if confidence is the only driver of value, a loss of confidence will see that bubble pop, and that's exactly what happened on October the 24th. The value of shares plummeted, and now people were left with debts to banks. The crowds panicked that they might lose their life savings if the bank closed, and they rushed to withdraw their money, which precisely caused the banks to close down. In 1929, about $14 billion was wiped out of the American economy. I mean, it was never there to begin with. The bubble had just caught up with them. Now, because we traded with America, we were going to be in for hard times no matter what. But the Royal Commission found that Triple M made it so much worse. With heaps of global money wiped out overnight, the price for commodities like wool had dropped. This meant that we had no chance of exporting our way out of trouble and paying off our debt. With London less willing to loan to us, New York now definitely wasn't an option, and we had a complete credit crunch. And because so much of our spending was financed by overseas banks, we left ourselves at the whims of other countries and lost much control over our own economy. The main finding of the Commission was that our government-run bank, the Commonwealth Bank, was unable to exert enough control over our own private banks. When times were good, the banks gave out too much money, and when times were bad, the banks were simply too cagey to give out loans. Chifley left the Commission with a very clear picture of our mistakes. We borrowed too much, consumed too much, and backed dud investments. Most of all, the government needed to have the power to put banks in their place. And that's what Chifley set out to do.
Capitalists in Australia shudder. Chifley wants to seize control of the banks.
Now, if you're sitting there thinking, why have I not been taught this? You're not alone. I used to be a high school history teacher and couldn't believe just how little I actually knew about Australian history. So I set out to learn all that I could, and Mr. M is the fruit of now years of research. I wouldn't recommend doing what I did though. It's completely time consuming and really not feasible if you have a job. So if you want the most efficient way to learn Australian history, I've got a classroom where each month lengthy topics are reduced to less than 5 hours of simple and clear modules that you can access. It's $25, so about the price of a book a month, and it funds videos like this. The application takes less than 60 seconds, and I will try to get back to you within a day. So, Economics 101. The price of something is controlled by supply and demand. With soldiers coming back from war and now returning to a job, the demand for something like eggs was going to be much higher. More competition for the same amount of eggs means higher prices. This would cause a rapid increase of prices across the board, and because it was now much more profitable to own a business, this would see businesses take loans to cash in on the rising market. The end result would be that with all these price hikes and the extra bank money in circulation, inflation would go up. Effectively, the value of all of your life savings goes down, and the value of people's debts to the banks gets reduced. And that second part might sound really good, like how good is it that those fat cats lose money on your debt? But like in the Great Depression, this could cause the banks to go bust, or it could force them into putting up interest rates so that they can keep pace with inflation. If they did this, Businesses would then be paying much more in loan repayments, causing layoffs, and consumers would be paying much more in mortgage repayments, giving them less money to spend in the economy. Think of it as using a blaster in Battlefront 2. You shoot too much too quickly, and the blaster overheats and throttles, forcing you to not shoot for a moment while it cools down. We call this the boom-bust cycle, and that's exactly what happened after World War I. So Chifley was like, okay, rather than have a graph that looks like this, what if we have a graph that looks like this? In other words, we deliberately slow down the growth of the economy and commit to only growing slowly. This was also amplified by the fact that Chifley wanted to build some huge projects that would last for a century, but would also spend decades building. If we allowed ourselves to fall prey to the boom-bust cycle, those projects might be abandoned during the bust years. So how do you paralyze the economy?
The Prime Minister remains unashamed about limiting national consumption.
So during the war, there were price controls which set a maximum profit margin for a business. They also rationed how many items of clothing and just how much of a particular food item you could buy. So Chifley was like, why don't we just keep these? It suppresses demand to keep prices under control. For the first 2 years after the war, these rations stayed before Chifley started easing them off. In 1947, we dropped the sugar ration, and in 1948, we dropped the meat and clothing rations. The inflation rate is measured by how much more a basket of goods cost compared to the previous year. From 1945 to 1946, inflation was zero. And when Chifley left office, it went like this. But more on that later. You definitely don't want zero forever because then your economy doesn't grow. Australia also struggled with its natural limitations. It was extremely dry, and only 50 to 60% of people living in rural areas had electricity. Chifley believed that this was a problem that his government could tackle with a mega project. These right here are the Snowy Mountains, one of the few places in Australia with consistent snow. When the snow melts, it runs off into the Snowy River, and that river would just go out to sea, sometimes having a destructive impact on the way. But if the government could divert the river into the Murray River and into the Murrumbidgee River, that would prevent its destruction and improve the water flow elsewhere. You could also build a whole bunch of dams, and they could provide hydroelectricity to those rural areas. There was just one problem with this. It would cost a lot of money. I'm talking nearly $1 billion, which is about $13.4 billion in today's currency. Stanley Bruce had tried rural projects as part of his Triple M strategy, but it failed badly. Chifley needed to make sure that the government could pay for this themselves without turning to foreign banks to fund it. But Chifley could do what Bruce couldn't. He was comfortable making a decision that Bruce could never entertain, having high income tax. Bruce had beaten the anti-socialist drum hard and promised that his government would see prosperity and growth. Chifley never made that promise. Though he did reduce them throughout his time in office, he had extremely high income taxes. At one point, the top tax bracket was 75%. What an absolute communist, right? Well, not really. It wasn't a permanent solution and just something that was only meant for the short term. In order to keep inflation under control, high taxes limited just how much a consumer could spend, while at the same time giving the government the funds to build projects that would dramatically improve the lives of people. The downside was that politically, this opened him up for attack from the opposition. But still, the high taxes were nowhere near as controversial as what came next.
It's official. Chifley wants to nationalize the banks.
So remember, Chifley felt as though the banks had too much leeway and could screw over the entire economy by either giving out too many loans or, by the other extreme, giving out no loans. Essentially, he wanted the government to control the banks rather than the banks to control the government. So in 1945, Chifley introduced the Banking Acts. These did two things. One, force every private bank to at least deposit a portion of their reserves with the government-owned Commonwealth Bank. And then two, force every state and local government to put their funds into the Commonwealth Bank rather than a private bank. Effectively, in order to rebuild at a slow speed, Chifley could control how much money the banks put into circulation. Obviously, the banks hated this. They were like, "Dad, why are you restricting how many AirPods I can sell on Temu? You're kind of restricting my profit here." But the local governments also didn't like this because they lost freedom over their own money. So Melbourne City Council actually launched a High Court challenge saying that Chifley was breaking the Constitution by not allowing for a division of powers between state and federal government. In 1947, the High Court agreed with them, and Chifley's laws were nullified. The political fight was now on. You see, I haven't actually mentioned what happened to Stanley Bruce's party since 1929. I've only really mentioned Labour. Well, Bruce's Nationalists actually merged with disgruntled Labour MPs to become the United Australia Party. Not that one. Palmer just invoked their name. This was now the second merger between parts of Labour and the opposition, and throughout the 30s, they were the government led by Joey Lyons. When he died, he was replaced with Robert Menzies, but Menzies lost the support of the party during World War II, and his government collapsed, leading to Labour's John Curtin becoming the leader. Menzies was simply seen as a bit of a simp for Churchill and allowed Britain to direct the war strategy, prioritising Germany. This was pretty bad optics when Japan began their assault on the Pacific, but Curtin actually stood up to Churchill, overruling him on where Australian soldiers should go. Labour had a glorious moment in the sun, and it was a nightmare for the UAP. So in 1944, Menzies was like, we need to change our strategy. The United Australia Party was simply the vaguest name, and it suggested that they didn't really stand for anything. So instead, Menzies revived the old name, the Liberal Party. We stand for freedom and against a heavy-handed government. Having been out of the fight for most of the 40s, Chifley's new Banking Act gave Menzies a rallying cry against the new socialist government. After all, restricting the banks was a very unliberal move. When the High Court nullified Chifley's laws, Menzies smelt blood and a chance to win the upcoming election. Chifley had two choices: roll over or fight Menzies. He chose the latter. 3 days after the decision, Chifley issued this press statement. Cabinet today authorised us to prepare legislation for submission to the Federal Parliamentary Labor Party for the nationalisation of banking other than state banks, with proper protection for shareholders, depositors, borrowers, and staff of private banks. If you got lost in the jargon, this was huge. The Commonwealth Bank would buy out all the shareholders in every bank in Australia, including British ones. They would then appoint new directors to do the will of the government, which in this instance was to keep growth slow. Menzies had thrown a Hail Mary in 1944, and in 1947, Chifley caught it. Menzies even invoked wartime language, calling it the second battle for Australia. This time, it was the Bank of New South Wales who launched a legal challenge, and once again, the High Court struck down the laws. However, a compromise was reached where the Commonwealth Bank could still keep the reserves of private banks. Still, this was massive. In 1949, Chifley and Menzies would finally square off in the election, and for all the talk of liberty versus tyranny, there was one real question on people's minds. Was it time to release the handbrake on the economy? But before we get there, any chance you could do us a favour? The Mystery History podcast is so close to cracking the top 10 history podcasts in Australia. If you give us a rating, click follow, and turn on notifications, you can actually put us in there. I reckon you'd love our 4-part series on how Eddie Obeid corrupted a huge faction within the New South Wales Labor Party. But Chifley wasn't corrupt. If anything, his willingness to take on the big banks showed his willingness to fight the elite and even be tarred with the communist brush. But it's worth pointing out that the actual communists really hated Chifley. So the Communist Party of Australia had their tentacles in some of the unions. One of those was the Australian Coal and Shale Employees Federation. We'll just call them the Miners' Federation to make it easier. With 25 miners dying each year, the Miners' Federation wanted better compensation. They demanded an extra 25% each year and a reduction in their working hours from 40 hours down to 35. With the Coal Tribunal refusing to meet these demands, they then went on strike in this area right here. This also came right as Australia was preparing for winter, and Chifley was in a sticky situation. You would expect that as a Labor Prime Minister, Chifley would side with the strikers, but he didn't. He felt that the miners were holding the nation to ransom not even 4 years after the war. And let's also be real, after the whole banking affair, it really wouldn't look that bad for Chifley to go after the commies. So Chifley acted swiftly. He called the strike a communist conspiracy, declared a national emergency, and passed laws which stopped other unions from funding the strike. 7 of the strikers were jailed for 12 months, and Chifley sent in 2,500 soldiers to do the mining themselves. Chifley's iconic quote was that the Reds must be taught a lesson. The real winner in this whole debacle was Robert Menzies. Menzies could still point to the fact that Chifley tried to buy out the banks and wasn't as anti-communist as he was. But now after the strike, a lot of the working classes were really mad at Chifley. Menzies' strategy was to position himself as the advocate of the forgotten people, those that either didn't belong to a union nor were CEOs. The tactical mistake of the United Australia Party was that it so obviously championed the interests of business owners. Instead, Menzies claimed that the Liberals were for the middle class and that he was willing to use government money to help get the middle class a house and enough money to sustain a family. Menzies also promised to take his handbrake off the economy. No more wartime rationing, and the banks had the freedom to make their own loans. Obviously, the banks loved this and they threw money at his campaign. In fact, Menzies is believed to have spent 10 times what Chifley spent. There was one other unknown going into this election. The number of seats in Parliament nearly doubled. In 1946, there were 74 seats, but now Australia had been divided into 121 seats. Even with this addition of 47 new seats, Labor only gained 3 of them. The coalition gained an extra 45, giving them a comprehensive 74 to 47 win. The Australian people, with a fair bit of help from the banks, had spoken, released the handbrake on the economy. What lay ahead was a turbulent couple of years, and you can get a really comprehensive picture in the think tank. Do it! The link's right there. Or at least watch the Cliff Notes version right here.